Just checking the settings here. They look like they're coming through, which is good. Which is good. Yeah, that looks like it's working okay. Let me know though if the sound does drop out or anything. So, hello. This is the first live stream I've done, live coding stream this year. I'm doing it on Twitter, YouTube instead of Twitch, because it's not really it's not one of those coffee and code type jobs. It's about answering a question, really. I got a question yesterday on Twitter regarding blocking emails from PHP. So this is where you've got like a list of email addresses, and you're sending out some emails to certain email addresses, and you want to make sure that some of these email addresses aren't being sent something. So you could think that this could be, I don't know, a blocking mechanism for things like your MailChimp suppression list. It could be bouncing emails. It could be spams or what have you. So the Twitter question was from someone called Kendra, and I was extremely busy yesterday, and so basically what I did on my lunch break is I just wrote a bunch of code and sent her the link. But as I've said before, when someone asks you a programming type question, it's not always a good idea just to send the code. It's a good idea to explain it as well. And I wrote it very quickly, so today what I'm going to do is review that code, explain that code, and also we're going to look at it from perhaps more of an object-orientated perspective as well. So let's go straight into the browser. Yeah, I'll go into the browser first. I'll show you what it actually does. So that's the GitHub page that I put it on GitHub. But if I go to the local host here, it's simply just a text box. So you can just type in your text box and then a send. So you could see this as kind of like one of those email subscription, so subscribe to an email, that kind of thing. So this needs to be an email address, and then when you hit send, it validates your email address against a list of email addresses to work out whether or not you should be sent an email or not. So the question, I basically tore it down into a couple of perspectives. The first is the actual validation of the email. Secondly, it's then deciding whether or not that should go through. So let's just go straight into the code. You probably understand a little bit more over the code rather than my babbling. So there we go. Right, so in PHP Storm here, what I've done is I created this is very sort of scripted. So you have an email of you have an array of bad emails, then you have an array of bad domains, because the question was also about removing an email from a particular domain. So perhaps you want to just stop all emails going to a particular domain. Then you have these two booleans here. So is bad domain, is address. We're setting them to true first of all. Then it does. I'm going to go through all of this in more detail in a minute, but basically what happens is you set some configuration up here, and then it checks if the input, which was a post, which is an email, should be a correct email. Then it does a bunch of this checking. So you have if email, and then it checks whether it is a bad domain, whether it is a bad address, and then this is the mechanism here which decides whether or not to send the email. So if bad address and bad domain equals it is false, then it will send it off. And then you have, what I've done is I've split these out into these kind of things here. So you have your function is bad domain and is bad address. Now when I did this, it certainly wasn't in these little functions. It was just basically a horrible nested set of if statements. And then what I did is I sort of broke those up into smaller functions, smaller processes, if you like. So the is bad domain is only focusing on the domain. So here we do a preg split to split out the left and right stuff between the @ symbols. The first part, or the second part in the array, which would be the domain, is then checked. So if it's not in the array, so of bad domains that you pass through, then that's set to false, and then that's just returned. So this just returns a boolean. Likewise with the is bad address. So so by default both of these are set to true, and then it just says, if it's not in an array, then you set that to false, and then off it goes. I'm not a massive fan of this, to be honest. Like I said, I did this really quickly, but there's a couple of things I'm already spotting, which I don't particularly like. I don't particularly like the way I've done this. For instance, the false and then the triple equals symbol. It's the Yoda kind of way. It's not. I don't know. Reading it doesn't really make sense straight away at a first glance. So I might change that as we go. But what I want to do now is sort of break this up into more of an object-orientated kind of manner. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go to bear with me a moment, in the browser. This is where I put the code. This is on the GitHub. So I've got this address to the code in the description, the video description here. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to create another file specifically for classes, because this is a huge, this is like what, 61 lines of code, 56 for the PHP. It's not very portable, and that's what object orientation can give you: portable code, do it in objects and that kind of thing. It also has a lot of, let's go back to the actual code to show you a little bit better. It also has a lot of responsibilities here. So the first responsibility is the configuration. So these are the bad emails and the bad domains. The second responsibility is the checking whether or not it is actually a proper posted value. Then thirdly, it's whether or not it is allowed to be sent as an email. And then lastly, it then does that whole process. So you can split it up into smaller little bite-sized pieces of work. So you might have, if you think of like a proper email processor, then you might have ways of injecting configuration in, injecting validation in. You might have ways of actually processing that via different email services and stuff like this. So this is a little bit sort of heavy-handed. And like I said, this is something that I wrote like off the bat. So I kind of want to review that today. But I hope that as sort of just the gist has helped Kendra with her question. But what I'm going to do, like I said, is improve this a little bit further. So in the block emails folder here, I'm just going to create a new folder. I'm not sure if you can see this on the stream, because what I'm doing is just creating some files and folders. I don't think the pop-ups actually work in the stream. But anyway, so I'm just going to enter in another directory name. We're going to just call this OOP for Object Orientation Programming. And we're just going to have another file in here. We're just going to call this index.php. Which, yeah, that's fine. There we go. That should be in there now. Bring that out a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. In here, I'm just going to copy this HTML. That's all I'm going to do for now. So the index.php, I'm just going to, I'll keep that. Index.php is just going to have that kind of stuff. And, oops, let's just, remove that. There we go. So here it's just going to post back to itself. This is all sort of standard stuff. That's fine. But we're also going to have another class which handles the emails. And if I go back to the index, what we're going to do here, like I said, is just break this up a little bit. So you've got the configuration here. This is going to be injected into perhaps an object. The object is then going to do the filtering and then check whether or not it's a valid email. So I'm just doing this off the cuff. I haven't really prepared anything, to be honest. So let's just create a new file. I'm just going to call this email processor. Sorry. .php. Let me just double check that. Just bear with me, Mo. It's all gone a little bit weird. Hold on. 2 seconds. Whilst I just double check something. This is good. Yep. Okay, let's press OK on that. So that now should be, we should now have another file called email processor, which is obviously going to do the processing of the email. Now, if I go back to this one here, we have the configuration. I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to copy that into the index here, because what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate the email processor, injecting some configuration in. So we're just going to open up the PHP tags like so. Paste that in. So we have the bad emails and the bad domains. That's fine. Essentially what I want to do is do a sort of a, let's do sort of step 1. So check post, then sort of like step 2, if I can spell step 2, process or something, and then sort of step 3, send. Or that should be probably process, that should be config. Right, so in my head I want to break this up into 3 different parts. So we check the post, make sure that the post is actually, you know, it's got a valid email in there, otherwise there's no point in doing any of this stuff. Then there is the configuration. This is going to inject the configuration bits and pieces in, and then we're going to process it out. So the email processor will need to take some of the configuration, and we're also going to have some other classes for doing the validation too. So if I go back to the original index.php file, we can see here we've got these 2 functions, the isBadDomain. Now, the isBadDomain and isBadAddress, they don't necessarily relate to each other, right? Because the isBadDomain is looking specifically for domains. If I scroll right to the top here, you can see that it is just these domains. It doesn't care about what's in here. So they have basically 2 different responsibilities. If you think about it from a sort of a solid principle, if you will, these have 2 different responsibilities. One is checking that the domain is bad, and the other one is checking if the whole address is bad. So you could see that as 2 separate classes, and you might also have other things as well. You might want to inject other ways to validate these things. It could be coming from, like I said, an email suppression list off of, say, MailChimp. It could be off of your spam list, something like that. Basically, these are ways of blacklisting stuff. We're just going to keep it to these 2 for now, but let's just create a class. Actually, let's just, in the email processor, I'm just going to create a class. And we're going to call this email processor, fine. And we're going to have a public function of configure. And we're going to have another public function of process, like that. And possibly a protected function called send. So that's going to take an email, and that's going to then send the email. That's going to do the process. This is going to be doing the configuration. So with the configuration in here, we could pass that in. So we could do email processor is equal to new. I'm going to have to sort of, sorry, require once or something to get that in. What am I doing? So that's OOP require once email processor, fine. So that should be now a new email processor, like so, which means that I should have access to those things, which I do, process and queue and configure. Obviously, I don't have anything for the send because that's protected. That's fine. But you can now sort of like inject things in. So with go back to the original one. Sorry, I'm going backwards and forwards. I'm just sort of double checking my bits and pieces. Let's put these in for now. So copy that, put those into here. So this is a protected. I don't know if you can hear that, but that's an alarm going off. Okay, so that's that. We're also going to have a protected, we're going to have a, protected. So that protected is valid because this is valid here. That should be a function, sorry. Will return true or false, whether or not the email is valid. It's going to do a check of that and a check of that, maybe. I'm kind of just making this up as I flow. So this here is basically, or this part here is what the is valid is all about. So we're just going to copy all of that as well. So we're going to bring that into here. We also need to perhaps pass in the email like that. We could have a protected array of bad domains like this. Basically, what I'm going to do is put this all in the email processor, and then I'm going to split it out into separate classes when I'm sort of happy with it. So bad domains like this. So we no longer need to have that at all, because we can just do this bad domains. In fact, we don't even need to do that at all because it's in the scope. So let's remove that. Let's remove this. That can now be this bad domains, because what we've done is we've encapsulated this within the class. So bad domains, and then this bad emails, I think. Yeah, save that. And the is valid here, if I go back to the index page, we are checking whether or not these, so if that is false, and if that is false, so basically if these are not bad addresses and if these are not bad domains, then we can go ahead and do this. It's a bit backward, isn't it? Because is bad means that by default would be true. So if true is that to me looks a bit complicated, overly so. Let's copy that, go back into into here. So that is then going to do the sending, I think. Yeah. So instead of actually going off and doing the sending, I'm just going to put in an echo, just to make things a little bit more clearer. So echo and then else. That was, what did I have that? Cannot send email. Fine. Because obviously with the processor, with this is valid isn't actually. Well, I tell you what, that needs to go up here. Sorry, mile a minute here. This needs to return a true or false. So let's say that's returning true. We can then do, instead of this big if statement, this horrible if block, we can then do if this is valid, passing in the email, which we're going to have to pass in through the process, like so. then that decides. So this is the decision maker. If this makes sense. So this will be either be true or false. The is valid based on whether or not these are right. So let's go back to here. It's this logic that I'm after. Let's copy that. I'm gonna have to move this down here. So that is true. This is false. So we could do is valid here is equal to false. That is equal to true. And then we don't need to have that because that's the default. And we just return is valid. Boom. Okay, so this is also this. Whoops, is bad address. Is that right? No, bad domain, I think. There we go. Removing that. Okay, so basically what I've done is I've split this out into those kind of logical flows. So you have the is valid, which is basically doing what this does, right? But instead of this sort of like higgledy-piggledy mess of if statements, I'm just double checking that, and then returning true or false. So I'm basically summarizing that statement into a single one, which is easier to read because you just call is valid, and if it is valid, then you send it, and so forth. So let's now configure this thing. And what I could do here is just do this send, passing in the email. There we go, just to finish it off. Obviously there's nothing in here, but whatever. We can now configure it. So in here, we can now do email processor configure, and perhaps we want to just put in the bad emails. Whoops. And also perhaps we want to put in the bad domains. Now you're probably screaming out and going, why are you doing this in configure and not in a constructor? I could do that as a constructor perhaps, but I'll talk about that in just a second. Let's just save that, go into there. What did I do that first as? It was, I forget, bad emails, bad domains. So this is an array of bad emails. This is also an array of bad domains, like so. We're going to just equal that to these things, and then we're just going to do this bad emails is equal to bad emails. And then likewise, this bad domains is equal to bad domains. There we go. So we've configured it, and then we can process it, which then does all the bits and pieces, the decision work, whether or not it's a bad domain, whether it's a bad email address. We've removed the need of, well, we've basically turned it into a couple of lines rather than here. It was just this massive mess of code. What else can we do? So in here, we can then do email processor and then process. And that is going to be obviously the email address that we process. So we could have a checking thing up here to check whether or not it's a proper posted email. That's what I'm going to do now. So let's just grab that, bring that up here. Nope, sorry, wrong file. In here. So email, and let's just make that a little bit smaller so you can see. So that's just doing a filter input of post. And then here we can do if email, like so. There we go. So step 1 is checking for the post. Step 2 is configuring it, which is this one here. Step 3 is processing it. So that's kind of what I had in my head as what I wanted to do. So we check check that the post is true. That will return false, or it will return the actual string. We then instantiate a new email processor, and then we configure the email processor, and then we process it. On the face of this, it looks to me okay, but this thing here is the issue that I've got with this. It's the fact that you could have a third way of configuring it. You could have a fourth way of configuring it, and therefore this would just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? These, like I said, could be coming in from all sorts of different places. So that might be a problem. Also, we might be looping over several email addresses, and of course, if we're doing that, we're going to instantiate another email processor each time. We're going to have to configure it each time, and then we're going to process it each time, which is a bit of a pain. So let's see what we can we do with that. Let's bring that over here. Go into email processor. Well, we could, very rightly so, we could create a constructor which constructs these things, injecting in the configuration. But the thing is, there is a big possibility that there could be more than two, and really you should keep your constructors nice and light. They should be configurable rather than sort of injecting bits and pieces in all the time, especially if it is just arrays and bits and pieces. So what I would do is perhaps have another class which deals with the configuration, which deals with how it's going to be validated, because you might have different email queues that need to have different ways of validating those email queues. For example, there could be a email that you send out, like a newsletter that you send out once a week. You could send out that email twice a week or whatever. You might be checking what other newsletters that user has been sent, and therefore, because you don't want to spam them. You don't want to send them a newsletter every day, that kind of thing, or whatever. So let's see how we can split this up. I'm just going to grab some tea. Bear with me. Nice cold tea. Right. Okay, so we have this configure thing. We have the email processor. I think what I'm going to do is look at both of these in a little bit more detail first, because this is the crux of what this validation is actually doing here. Like I said, these have two different responsibilities: the is bad domain and is bad address. So we could have a series of classes here for each one. So you could have I don't know, let's say domain checker class. I'm just going to put that in. You could also have another file, another PHP class. You could call that address checker, that kind of thing, which handles those specific tasks. Then the processor would then be you could add those to the processor via a routine of configuration, and then it would loop through those types of checking devices on each of the email addresses and check those things out. That's probably what I'm going to do. Let's just tidy this up, though. I want to do another thing here. Let's do checker, and let's just put those in just to make it tidier. So we now have a series of checkers, and we also have this email processor, like so. I'm also just going to create. No, let's just leave it like that. That's fine. So let's deal with one of these first. Let's deal with the address. This one at the bottom here. That's good. I'm just double checking that was there. That's fine. So let's just copy that. That is the address here. So let's just do a public function, or not public function. What am I doing? A class of, what was this? Address checker. And this class will have a refactored function, like so. And what I'm going to do is just copy the guts out of this, like that. It's going to have, it's going to pass in an email, and we're just going to call it is valid. It's also going to have some an array of blacklist. So we're going to have let's think private blacklist, which is just an array. This is then going to be blacklist. So now, can you see I'm just trying to sort of make it a little bit more generic. We're going to, instead of is bad, that's not really good, is it? Is valid is what I'm going to do. So if we're going to set that to false, because I don't like having that as true by default, and we're going to do if in array. So if it is in array, then is valid is false. There we go. So basically making it a little bit more readable, making it a little bit more tidied up. We've also got this blacklist here, so we can do a public function, and we can do set blacklist. So that passes in an array of blacklist, and that is just going to do this. This blacklist equals blacklist. Fine. No worries there. And basically, it's kind of going to be very similar, right? So we're going to copy that, put that into the domain checker. It's going to be a very sort of similar thing, domain checker. But the guts here, so we have a blacklist of domains that we don't like. Let's just remove that. But in this case, we've got this preg bits and pieces, so I'm just going to copy that like so, put that into domain checker. Where is it? In here. That's cool. So we then have parts. We split the email off. This is the blacklist, and is valid is going to set to false, and that's going to be let me just double check. What have I got? False. Oops. If in array, sorry, what am I going to do? So valid is true. Then if that is in array, or I could do false if I'm getting myself confused on a boolean. That's not good. So if that is in an array, that needs to be true, and that needs to be equals false. There we go. So if that isn't in an array, then it is valid. There we go. That's what I wanted to do. So with the domain checker, it's then if it isn't in that blacklist, then it is true, like so. So by default, it's always invalid, because if you don't have that @ symbol, then it's going to be invalid, right? So that's fine. And then there we go. So that's the guts of it. That's the guts of both the address checker and the domain checker. They're very simple, similar classes, but they are solely on that responsibility of just checking whether or not the domain is valid or checking whether or not the address is valid. But what we've done here is we've removed the whole these responsibilities out of the email processor. So I'm going to remove that from here. Let's save that. But now how do I add those to the processor? Well, in the index file, when we're configuring, we can set what types of checking we want to do. So up here with the require once, what I need to do obviously is require these things, and I could do this via auto loading, but I'm just not going to right now. Let's do checker, and then it is address checker, Next one is checker, and it's domain checker. So pretend we've got these. So we have the domain checker here. So domain checker, just checking on time because I do need to get off and do some bits and pieces later. Is a new domain checker, and then we have address checker is equal to new address. Now you could put in the blacklists into these checkers as constructors, perhaps. So you could do a public function because their purpose is solely to check, right? So they're not doing anything else. So this blacklist is equal to blacklist like that. So that is an array. Whoops. And we're going to just copy that quickly over to here, like so. So we have the blacklist, we could pass that in. So in the index, when we're instantiating these things, bad emails goes into the address. Bad domains goes in the domains, like that. Okay, so that is how we configure these checkers. Or if we wanted to, we could instantiate the class and then just run the set blacklist stuff. So okay, so we've now filtered this out. That's fine. So that's now seen as a posted email. That's all good. We then instantiate the processor. Now we need to deal with this configuration. Well, we're not calling the configures off of these things anymore. We need to inject these dependencies, these domain checkers and these address checkers, as dependencies of the email processor. However, when I say dependencies, I don't mean that we should be injecting them through the constructor, which we could do, but you might want to tailor the order in which these are checked, right? So what I'm kind of thinking is, instead of having the configure passing in these things, we just pass in an array of checkers, right? So, and we're going to remove this. So this is now checkers, like so. We're going to give that that, and then we're just going to do this. Whoops, this, if I can spell it, this checkers is equal to, and you know, checkers is probably not a very good thing. It could just be validators, right? But that's probably a better term, isn't it? Validators. Let's do that. Validators. Like so. That could be, I mean, that should be really private, to be honest. Not that there's anything extending this. And then when we do the process, when it's calling is valid, what we need to do is do a loop over. So we do for each this validators as a validator, like so. So we're looping over the classes that we've injected into the configure, and we then do validator is valid, passing in the email. Because what we're doing now is we're calling the is valid off of this, so is valid like that. So let's just remove all of this. We don't need any of that. And that's fine. And you would obviously check, you would obviously set something here that it is valid, and that would do that. And yeah, so now instead of the configure, what we're doing is we're passing in an array of these things. What we could do, in fact, with that is we could do public function add validator. And we could just simply pass in a validator into here, and then we do this validators equals validator. So it's more what's the word? It's more sort of configurable, I guess is the right term. So you can either configure. I'm going to call that set validators rather than configure, because that sounds better. So set validators or add a validator. So it could be either an array of validators or it could just be a single validator. So in the in here, we're just going to remove that. We're just going to do an add validator, passing in the domain checker. Now the problem here is that I haven't defined what add validator, what type of class I need. So this is where interfaces come in. So the domain checkers, I'm now going to call these to domain validator rather than valid. I'm having a real problem spelling validator. Validator. There we go. Just checking on the time. That's all good. Like that. Let's just rename these. Yes. Where's the refactor? Rename. Yep, that's good. Okay, so these, I'm just going to rename the whole folder as well, just because, to validators. That's fine. Yep, that's been changed. All good. So now we have our validators, and we can pass in the validator. We can add the validators in. We might want to do like we might want to do the address check before we do the domain check, that kind of thing. So this is giving us a way of ordering the types of checking that we can do. Now, like I said, I haven't actually defined what should go into this add validator in terms of a class. So what I'm going to do is just quickly spin up an interface. So let's just create a validator interface. Whoops. And this interface, so we have, interface, validator interface. We need to have, what do we need to have? Let's go back into here. We need to have is valid and set blacklist. So public function is valid, and public function, what did I have? That's set to set blacklist. Set blacklist, like that, taking in the array of blacklist, like that. Awesome. And then in here, what I can do is implement that. So we do an implements of the validator interface, like so. And again, what have I missed? Is valid? Yes. Needs to take an email. There we go. So that's the domain. Then the address does that, which now means that in the email processor we can now do define what type of validator we need, which is just the validator interface, like so. So set validators does all of that. What we can do is do a for each validators as validator, and this is this add validator passing in the validator, like so, which means that what we're doing is we're checking for the type, right? So we're ensuring that yes, we pass in an array, but it's an array of validators, because we would get an error if it's not. Also, with the whole sort of is valid thing, because we have this validators for each is a validator, we now have access to that through the interface. So yeah, what I'm going to do is just return this on that, like so. And just going to tighten that up a little bit. With the process, that's going to return this too. Just tidying this up a little bit, so that's just going to return that. Let's now put in some comments. I tell you what, I won't bore you with all of this for now. I need to shoot off in just a second, but I just want to just sort of recap what I've done compared to this sort of scripted way of doing it. So with the scripted way of doing it, what we've done is we have these arrays of bad emails and bad domains. We then have a bunch of conditions, whether it's true. We can configure the email, and then we check whether or not it is a posted email. We then do an awful lot of legwork here to find out whether it is a bad domain, whether it is a bad address, that kind of thing. Going down into these functions now, these functions will decipher that kind of information. Like I said, when I first wrote all of this, this was just massive if statements in a big horrible mess up here. And then after that, this is kind of like the control logic, the processing logic, decides whether or not it is a bad address, decides whether or not it is a bad domain. Then if both of these things are set to false, then it goes off and does the email, or not. So the problem with this is it's like 56 lines of PHP code, not counting the comments. I should, and it's not you can't really move it about. It's not very portable. So what I wanted to do is change that to a more of an object-orientated approach. So with the index.php here, what we've got is just a simple form, and that form does just includes all of this stuff. This should really be in autoloaders. We have our bad emails and bad domains, but now what we've done is we've defined responsibilities. We've defined a set of validators that validate these things separately. So we have the domain validator and we have the address validator, and we pass in the configuration into these things. We could also do this. We could also do domain checker set blacklist, so we can also put in the blacklist too. These are basically just arrays of bits and pieces of the bad emails and bad domains. Fine. We then do the checking, which we did before, which is checking whether or not we do have a proper posted value. And when we do, we then instantiate the email processor, we add the validators, and we do the processing. Now this stuff up here could be moved out of this. We could put this down here, and we could even move all of that somewhere else. So this whole piece of logic could be handled before we even get to this template. And so all we need to do is call email processor and then process. So in fact, we have step 1 is configure. Now, step 2 is checking the post, and step 3 is to process. It'll work the same. All we're doing is we're instantiating the processor before we do that. That's fine. We could have done that before, of course. So when we add the validators here, let's just click onto that. What we're doing is we're providing an interface, a validator interface. What I've just noticed is these are not correct. Let's just do that before I do talk any further, otherwise that's just going to annoy me. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so we have the add validator interface, which, if I just drag this code out a little bit here, this is where we're defining it. So every validator needs to have and is valid in a set blacklist public functions. And we're just basically queuing these up, queuing these validators up. Then we're doing a process which is checking the internal is valid call. If we scroll down here, which is then doing a for each loop, checking whether or not it is valid. So basically what I should do here is have a check on is valid, but what I need to think about is valid is just because one is valid doesn't mean that the other one isn't valid, if that makes sense. So sort of if what I could do, I guess it's a bit of a hack, but if is valid equals, or let's just do it as a Yoda. So if this is valid, if valid is false, then what we do is we continue, or something, or we break. That's probably better if we can. So we come out of this for each loop, which means that obviously the next one isn't going to be processed. We come straight out of this for each loop, and then that is set to false. However, if this is true, then it goes to the next validator and so forth. I'm just double checking these things. Okay, that's fine. I'll deal with that in a minute. That's no problem. So yeah, it just gives us a way of scheduling these things up. I say scheduling, queuing these things up, because what you could do, of course, if I go back to the index, is we could do it in a different order. So perhaps we want to check the address first and then check the domain, or perhaps we want to check the domain and then check the validators, the address. So it's a different way. We are defining how we would like to process the emails without actually calling process. We're actually sort of configuring it first, which makes our lives a little bit easier, I believe, because we can alter and change these sort of plug-inable bits and pieces. Using the interface here, we're ensuring that if we ever have another way of checking or validating an email address, then we could put this in and conform to these bits and pieces. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment all of this stuff and upload it to GitHub, but I thought that it would be fun to go through this morning. If you've found this useful at all, then do let me know. Put your thoughts in the comments in the comment section below. Yeah, I hope this helps anyone who wants to learn more about object orientation, wants to learn more about interfaces and that kind of thing, and how you can sort of refactor code to make it a little bit more configurable. I do apologize for all of my rambling that I've gone through today, but hey, I will speak to you all again soon. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding. Cheers.